Well, today we are having a discussion, what is democracy, based on de Tocqueville, a philosophy, not about our parties, not about our elections, the philosophy of democracy. Bill Cook, I met in Aspen a couple of years ago, brought him here to talk about Dante. He's been a medieval historian for over 42 years. He's extraordinary, and he gave me the idea, let's talk about de Tocqueville. But he had told me this a year ago. But then the virus hit, and I canceled it, and we'd made it now. Now is the time we really need to think about it. Everybody has to think about it. Bill is a political junkie. He ran for Congress based on his understanding of de Tocqueville. Of course, he lost, but that's okay. He ran anyway. He wanted to run. He said how much he liked it. He's also a man that has a destiny in his life, and he created a foundation, and he travels all over the world to help poor children to get educated and clothed, because that's the only way you possibly can get democracy, is having a literate society and one that feels that they can understand the world. So I would like to introduce Bill Cook to this topic, and he's going to talk. We're having a buffet lunch, and if it's imperative that you interrupt him, lift up your hand, but we're going to wait to have questions. And we're not in any rush, and if you are, let us know, but anyway, enjoy yourself.
You can tell that ears are not designed for masks, hearing aids, and glasses at the same time. I wear this mask because it is the flag of Myanmar. And it has a special place in my heart because when I was an infant, that's where my father was in World War II. And so I've been back many times, and obviously I've been mourning with the people of Myanmar as what they faced the last week. And it's so interesting to see the protest by the National League for Democracy and the demands for democracy in that faraway country. We can only offer them hopes and prayers that they will succeed and that it will not be as bloody and violent as previous attempts have been. So I particularly have Myanmar sort of weighing on me as we talk today about democracy. We need to begin, I'm a historian after all, with a little bit of background. I don't want to do the whole biography of Alexis de Tocqueville. He was a French nobleman born after the Revolution, born in 1805. Some of his descendants still live in the Chateau de Tocqueville in Brittany, in fact. Tocqueville became a lawyer, and at the age of 25, after a change in government in France, Tocqueville became more convinced that France and other countries in the West were inevitably going to move toward democracy, and he wanted to learn more about it. And so he decided to come here. After all, this 44-year-old democracy of the United States was the oldest democracy in the world then. And so with a friend of his named Gustave de Beaumont, they set sail for the United States. Now, in theory, they were going actually with a commission from the French government, which gave them all kinds of credentials so that they got to meet both President Jackson and former President John Quincy Adams. Their commission was to study a new kind of incarceration in the United States called the penitential system, coming from the word that refers to having them to regret the sins that they've committed so that they won't do it again. The two main prisons he wanted to visit were in Philadelphia and in Auburn, New York, which is sort of in the center of New York. But Tocqueville writes on the boat in his diary that we're coming here to study prisons, but we're really coming here to study democracy, because it is the wave of the future. He traveled for almost 11 months in the United States, Now, think about this. This is 1831. He started in the east. He went up the Hudson River to Albany. He went across Albany to Buffalo. He didn't go on the Erie Canal, but he paralleled it. It was new at the time, 6 years old. He went to French-speaking Canada. He went to Michigan. He went to Green Bay, Wisconsin, which I think today some people still regard as kind of third world, unless you're a football fan, of course. He went down, he came back to the east. He went down the Ohio River, down the Mississippi to New Orleans, meeting Sam Houston on the way by accident, traveled up through the south to Washington, back to New York, and sailed home. And when he got home, he and Gustave de Beaumont wrote a book about prison reform. Pretty good book, actually. But while Beaumont wrote a novel, Tocqueville wrote Democracy in America. It's in 2 volumes. The first volume was published in 1835. It won a prize in France. And it is largely, even in a fairly narrow sense, political. But he decided he needed to write a companion volume, which he published in 1841, along with the first volume being republished. And it's more of cultural and social and so on. So the two are separate in some ways, but they really do make a book. They really are a good set to make a book. And everybody, it seems, loves Tocqueville. That the translator that we use here, Harvey Mansfield, a very fine scholar at Harvard, wrote that Democracy in America is the best book ever written about democracy, and it's the best book ever written about America. Now, I got to tell you, there's a lot of competition for both. And that he could make that a plausible case says something about Tocqueville's Democracy in America. In the 90s, it was interesting because the 2 major rivals in Washington, Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich, both loved Tocqueville. Clinton quoted it all the time, and Newt Gingrich wrote to the freshman members of Congress coming in and said, here's your assignment. Declaration of Independence, Constitution, Federalist Papers, and Tocqueville. They had somewhat different approaches. There are different parts of Tocqueville that each one liked more than the other. But the point is, he's such a widely loved and revered figure. In fact, some of the things he says that are often quoted, he never said. That's true of all famous people, by the way. Tocqueville's most quoted line is, America is good because America is great because America is good. And if America ceases to be good, it will cease to be great. Nice idea, but it was first written down in 1941 and somehow got retroed back to Tocqueville. But what I want to do in this first period, we may have some more after lunch, is to talk not so much about his comments on the Constitution, which are really interesting and insightful, and sometimes critical. Perhaps I'll mention one of his criticisms because it's perhaps relevant to recent times. He thought that one of the worst mistakes that the writers of the Constitution made was to allow the president to be reelected. Because he talked about the fact that if a president is going to be able to be reelected, he's going to be using the first term as a way of making sure he gets reelected. That's going to change the whole way the government operates for the first term of any president. A sort of interesting comment, one that we could look at in many different cases in the United States, but he was convinced of that. But in general, having read the Federalist Papers and knowing the Constitution and being a lawyer, he was very impressed by certain things that sometimes we don't think much about. He is really impressed by the jury system, for example. Among other things, he fears that in a democracy, there's not very much emphasis on procedure. And as a lawyer, as I suppose all lawyers, they're into procedure. The jury is the school, he says, for American citizens, because there they are instructed by the judge as to what they can and cannot take into account, and so on and so forth, and it teaches that discipline that democracy requires procedure. And in fact, he says if there is an aristocracy in the United States, it's an aristocracy of lawyers. So he has some interesting comments about our Constitution and the structure of our democracy, but I'm not going to dwell on those things. They're part of the book. I don't know, when I teach this book, I always ask students at the end of the semester, bring me your book, I want to see what you marked up. And the parts about the analysis of the Constitution are the least marked up part, as it turns out. For one thing, of course, the students have already studied the Constitution, some in school, but there are just a lot more things that catch their attention than somebody else commenting on the Constitution. But I come from the school of thought that says, if you want to know what a book is about, read the first few lines. Right? Of course, the classic is, right, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Let me tell you my other favorite, though. See if you can identify what's just the first line of. Who's there? It's a great first line. I'm going to tell you what it's from, and then you'll say, well, of course. It's the first line of Hamlet. Isn't Hamlet all about who's there? Who's acting and who's being him or herself? Who's hiding behind a cloak? It's a great line. So let's look at the first few lines of Democracy in America. If you've got your book, this is cleverly on page 3. Among the new objects that attracted my attention during our stay in the United States, none struck my eye more vividly than the equality of conditions. I discovered without difficulty the enormous influence that this primary fact exerts on the course of society. It gives a certain direction to public spirit, a certain turn to the laws, new maxims to those who govern, and particular habits to the governed. Soon I realized that this same fact extends its influence well beyond political mores and laws, and that it gains no less dominion over civil society than over government. It creates opinions, gives birth to sentiments, suggests usages, and modifies everything it does not produce. Now, of course, that leads to a fairly important question. What exactly does he mean by equality of conditions? Of course, he's not talking about economic things, not talking about everybody having the same amount of money, although there was a much narrower band of economic difference than there is now in the United States. And he's not talking about equality before the law per se, but this general sense that everyone sort of looks in the face of any other person and sees an equal. Let's talk about that for a minute. You know, Tocqueville, again, was Alexis de Tocqueville. The very fact he's got a de in there, which tells where he's from, says he's nobility. And we can imagine the society he grew up in, a local society in Brittany, even after the Revolution, where, you know, if his father or he are walking along the street, you can imagine people sort of standing aside and say, bonjour, monsieur de Tocqueville, or whatever it is, paying some sort of tribute to the person by nature of the rank. But not in America. People walk by each other as equal. Rightly or wrongly, they think that their opinion counts as much and is as good as the person they walk by. And it's this equality of conditions, which has something to do with our more modern phrase, equality of opportunity, but is much more than that. It really is, I like the adjective better, it's really an egalitarian principle. In fundamental ways, we really are all equal. Everybody counts one, not just on election day, but every person is a full citizen. Now, you know, in aristocratic societies of Europe, where Tocqueville came from, for example, nobles were entitled to very often have their cases treated in different courts than commoners. Of course, that's not true in the United States. Everybody goes before the same judge. And so Tocqueville is struck by this egalitarian thing, and he says it's not just about politics. It has to do, as he says, with mores, with values. He has a chapter I'm going to talk about a little bit later on about the democratic family. Families are different in democracies, he says. Everything's different in a democracy. Here's my family example. I taught a course for years on the democracy in America to freshman students at my university in New York. And some of them were immigrants, some were children of immigrants, and we would sort of talk about certain things in the family. And I'd ask them this question, okay, you go home for the weekend, and your mom and dad and 3 brothers or sisters are there, and how do you decide what you're going to do? What if you disagree? What if you want to go to one restaurant and 2 of your brothers and sisters want to go to another restaurant? What do you do? And many of the families that were, in America for a long time said, well, we kind of take a vote. That stunned most of the students who were immigrants because dad decides or somebody else decides. And it was interesting to see that was a way of penetrating that idea that there is such a way that the ideas of democracy trickle down into things that are not political at all. In fact, most of the second volume of this, which is almost half the entire book, is written primarily not about government at all. And I think very often we undervalue that part of democracy in America. Now, let me suggest this. Tocqueville says, here is the great paradox of democracy. On the one hand, you need for democracy to work, citizenry to be active. People need to be out in the streets, they need to talk as well as vote, and so on. But equality drives people away from public spaces. Because, I'm Dr. Cook. Not in the streets of my hometown, I'm not. I am in my classroom and all that sort of stuff, but that doesn't count for anything in my neighborhood. I don't get 2 votes on who has to shovel the snow and the sidewalks. And that there is a tendency, Tocqueville says, where people want to retreat from the public space because they can retreat to places of privilege. You can tell your kid to wash the dishes. You can, in a department meeting, say, hey, I'm a full professor, I count more than you. You don't say it quite that way. But the tendency is to want to withdraw. And, I got to tell you, many of you have had this experience, I can tell by the gray hair. You like being with your grandkids because they look up to you and call you grandma and grandpa or some particular name you have for grandma and grandpa. And that's a lot more fun than just, walking by somebody on the street who doesn't give a damn who you are. So there's this tendency. This is one of the great ironies. In a place that requires citizens to be active, there's a tendency to withdraw. And so one of the things that Tocqueville admires so much about America is there are institutions and practices that have evolved to turn that back around, to get people in the public square. There are a lot of them. Let me tell you about a place I recommend you visit. Some of you have probably been to Sturbridge Village, the sort of colonial town reconstructed in Massachusetts where, you're bringing a building from here and a building from there and redo the village. Well, there's an early American one of those called the Genesee Country Museum, which is about 15 miles from where I live. And it really is from buildings from the time of Tocqueville, and Tocqueville passed through this area. So I take my students there, and let us look at the kind of villages Tocqueville saw. Remember that Tocqueville was in New York City, which had 200,000 people at the time, but he spent most of his time in small-town America because most America was small-town America. And so what do we find? First of all, the town was built with the town square. And town square is where people gather and where people talk. You can talk to each other. Somebody can stand up on a soapbox. By the way, when I ran for Congress, I bought a soapbox. It was really cool. I had my own prop. And I could sort of pull it out. I forget, Fell's Naphtha or something. Some old brand. And that was a pretty good prop. But the town is arranged for people to come together around the main square and talk. Not necessarily organized talk, but you see the people who are there, whether they are getting a newspaper, whether they're buying food, whether they're buying clothes, whether they're going to church. Everything is on or near the town square. So the physical space in America, which after all derived from those New England meetings and those New England towns, that was quite important for democracy. If you walked around that square, you saw several newspaper offices. I lived in still a rural small county, but at the end of the 19th century, we had 3 newspapers: the Republican, the Democrat, and the Independent. So that there were different voices. It also contained, obviously, lots of non-political local news and all that sort of thing. So there were newspapers, and Tocqueville says when he traveled, he would stop at log cabins. I assume somebody must have had a Diet Pepsi for him. And he would go into the cabin, and he said, you know, these are really poor places, a lot of them. The 2 things he could count on is there was a Bible and there were newspapers. That people were informed. The newspapers were available. There were several of them. That also kept the price down. And so newspapers were very important. In fact, Tocqueville concludes ultimately that freedom of the press might be the most important of all the freedoms for the preservation of democracy. Also on that town square was a town hall, where, of course, the town government met. But also, it was a place for social events. It's big enough for the people of the town. That could be a party, that could be the 4th of July, that could be a Christmas pageant, that could be a dance. But there was a building, so even in the cold months in western New York, people could gather. And that was very important. And he pointed out that if you went to the inn on the town square, which among other things would have some people that were passing by and staying there and eating, there were no private tables. You sat with whoever was there. Could be somebody who lives down the road from you. It could be somebody who just passing through on the way to Buffalo. But then you go to one of the big houses, not the little cabins, but one of the bigger houses, and what's the big room of the house called? It's called a parlor. Comes from the French verb, ultimately the Latin verb, that means to talk. This was a society of talking. And everything, including the physical landscape of small towns, was designed for talking. The square, the presence of newspapers, the town hall, the inn, people talked. Now, you know, we hear a lot of talk these days. I think one of the questions that we can ask ourselves is, if you agree with Tocqueville about the importance of talk, about the importance of just literally being in the public space and listening to different opinions and hearing different stories from out of town or from local people. We don't have those kinds of spaces today, partly because of size of things. I think I found out last night in the almanac, I hope I didn't misread it, there are 109,000 people living in Palm Beach. There's no place where 109,000 people could gather even if they wanted to. 1.5 million in this county. Where do people gather? Where do they talk? They can talk in very private places and a lot of very privileged places. But where do people of all sorts mingle and talk and sort of physically experience one another and hear different points of view? Obviously, a lot of people have studied that question in relationship to the internet and all this sort of thing. Can we create in virtual situations and chat rooms and so on and so forth, can we find some new technological way to reproduce that? It may not be the same, but can we replace the value of talk in another way? Because most people don't live in towns with town squares. I happen to, but most people don't. Most people don't have a town hall that could hold everybody in the town. I do. My town of Geneseo, New York, has 6,000 people in it. And that's on a day when a lot of students are in town. So these are important things to think about. Now, Tocqueville looks and says, in addition just to the physical space, there are several practices and institutions that have developed that allow for the expression of life. Because, well, think about it. Washington, D.C. is a long way away. It's a long way away from here. But it's a long way away from Geneseo, New York. How many people in 1831, when Tocqueville came to the United States, would have been to Washington? Or for that matter, to Albany, our charming capital? charming in quotation marks, and so it's one of the least charming places on planet Earth. But at any rate, we are far distant from our federal government. And if we are going to have a participatory democracy, we need to have what Tocqueville calls intermediary institutions. We need to have something that bring people out, even if they're far away from their national capital or even their state house. And he says there are three of these institutions, intermediary institutions, that make America work. Number one, local governments. Local governments, Tocqueville says, matter. They matter in a lot of ways. Because most things you do with the government get done locally, with the justice of the peace, or the mayor, or the village council, or if you live in New England, you still have the town meetings. And local governments are really important. If local governments don't do anything or can't do anything, that would be very destructive, Tocqueville says. One reason is they have lots of offices, and they have very short terms, usually 1 year. And so that means that you've got in a community a lot of people who have done some government service, who have been in an office, and they learn about some of the procedures that are required in office holding. I mean, I don't know about many of you, but I sort of get tired of hearing people say things about the government. You know, well, if I were in Congress, I would. And you want to say, no, you wouldn't. They don't do things that way. Well, if I could say to the governor, he probably wouldn't pay much attention to you. And you'd have a hard chance finding Andrew Cuomo anyway. He's always on CNN, for one thing. But local governments are, just like juries, they are classrooms for democracy. And Tocqueville uses that language. And Tocqueville is worried about them not being powerful. And here's the language he uses. He says the Constitution gives centralization of authority. Not all authority, we have the 10th Amendment after all, but there is a centralization of authority to declare war, interstate commerce, those sorts of things. And that's very important. But Tocqueville says, in all other matters, administration should be as local as possible. He really believes that if the state and the federal government take too many things away from towns and villages and small cities, first of all, why would you want to run for those offices if you knew you couldn't do anything? I hear that all the time in school board elections where I live. People say, I'd love to be in the school board, but Albany tells us all this stuff and we have virtually no discretion. So who wants to be in the school board? That kind of thing. Tocqueville talks about the centralization of administration, not authority, but administration. And he has a conversation with a man who later on became a cabinet officer in the John Tyler administration named Charles Canfield Spencer, who, by the way, supervised the publication of an English version in the United States. And what he said was, Albany, meaning our state capital, he was a state legislator at the time, Albany sort of sets the basic rules for school, and then we figure out how to do them in Canandaigua, New York. And the more we leave administration to local people, the better off we are. Now, we know a lot, especially, I see a lot of gray hair, most of us have lived through the civil rights movement. And we sort of know, that certain things probably in Mississippi are not going to be done without some federal invasion of the state because of the fact that the people's rights are so discriminated against. But the principle, I think, is very important. Whenever possible, decentralize administration. By the way, Tocqueville was really smart. He realized that New York was the most administered state of all the states from its state capital. And by the way, it still is. But I think we very often ignore the importance of local government. They are the pothole guys, but that's important too. And here's another reason why local governments matter. If you've got a problem you want to address to the governor or the state house or to the federal government, you don't get to talk to those people. And very often. I mean, we're a very privileged group here. I bet there isn't a person in this room who has not met a few members of the House, a couple of senators, 2 or 3 presidents, and so on and so forth. Because this is kind of a movers and shakers group. And me too. You chat with this person, chat with that person. Most Americans have never met anybody close to that level of office. And if they have, it's just shaking hands at a school. That those folks are a long way away. After all, nowadays, a House member represents way more than 500,000 people. So we need to have local governments that do things because we feel so unempowered with state and federal officials. But, and you all know this, especially if you've ever lived in a small town, and again, Tocqueville's just seeing small towns, although he's born and lived in Paris. What he sees is really quite wonderful in these small towns. Somebody says, the cities or the village or the town is ignoring fixing my street. People in the next street over have better pavement than we do. So what are you going to do? I'm very proud. I have a son who came from Vietnam when he was 14. I adopted him. And Vietnam's a lot different. And Saigon's a lot different than the United States. But he lives in Geneseo now. He's married, has a kid. And about a year ago, I guess he's been listening to me after all. I never knew he paid attention to anything I ever said. He said, our street isn't very well paved. And I got a petition from all the people on our street, and I took it to the village board and told the mayor to get to work on this or we're not going to vote for her. Now, in our village, 50 votes can win or lose an election. Whether the street's going to be fixed or whether it's going to be fixed the way he would like it, I don't, but he's been heard. And that is empowering. I did something that allowed me to be heard. Now, obviously, you need different tactics if you want to be heard by your state legislator, if you want to be heard by your U.S. senator, or whatever. But he feels so empowered by the fact that he did something. It wasn't a big deal, but he got heard. And that, I think, is an extraordinarily important thing. And we all know, you hear stories like this all the time. There's a street where a lot of kids play and the parents get together and sign a petition to lower the speed limit or to put a crosswalk for a disabled child. Those things get done. And that's how you learn to do politics. If you start saying the only way to be involved in politics is to be able to tell my congressman what I want him or her to do, very few people are going to feel empowered. But if you said, look at that crosswalk. We went to the village board and look at that crosswalk. So I think that we have really, in many states, New York especially, have abandoned leaving anything important to local government. I'm a good friend of a person who is the CEO of the New York Council of Mayors. And although the mayor of New York and Buffalo and whatever are there, it's mostly small town mayors. And they are so frustrated that they aren't given the means or the freedom. I learned this the other day. It made me crazy. We had a dedication of a new historical marker. Nice. They had to get approval from Albany to put up a historical marker. That's about a woman who lived 150 years ago. And it had to measure so many centimeters, well, inches, I guess, and whatever. And it took years to get a historical marker in our village to honor a local person. That's what makes you crazy. And that's what Tocqueville says really turns people off. It wants to make them, again, go inside with their friends and their families and say, to hell with all this. So I think if Tocqueville were around today, one thing that would worry him a great deal is the lack of civic participation at the local level, caused at least in part by the lack of authority that local governments have vis-a-vis the state and the federal government that have X number of pages of regulations and so on and so forth. So that's the first of these intermediate institutions. The second is what Tocqueville calls political associations. This is any private organization that has in mind the change of laws. So that's a lot of different people. That is the NRA, the Sierra Club, the AARP, the Disabled American Veterans, the Chamber of Commerce, and you can name another million or so. And these are, again, important classrooms for democracy because people meet around one issue. So if you are going to go to the Sierra Club, you're not going to debate abortion. You're not going to debate whether Puerto Rico should be the 51st state. You're going to talk about the environment and certain specific things that you would like your state legislature or the Congress to do. And what does that mean? It means that people who are very different from each other, think about all those organizations. They all have old and young, rich and not rich, male and female, Protestant, Catholic, Jew, atheist, and everything else, gay and straight, people with 20 body piercings and 74 tattoos, and people with none of that. And they don't talk about a lot of different issues. They're there to talk about something they love, the preservation of the environment, building a nature trail in a state park, or lobbying for some larger environmental legislation. And because they're there on some focused issue, they work together, they cooperate, and they find out they kind of like each other in many cases. And as Tocqueville points out, he doesn't say it in these words, but he says it essentially, everybody is in some minority, political, ethnic, religious, whatever. Everybody's in a religious minority. Right? There's no one form of religion that more than half the Americans profess. I mean, I'm counting different denominations separately. So if you're going to be empowered in America as a citizen, you've got to work with people with whom you have disagreements and who are different than you. You've got to build coalitions. That's hard. We all know it's hard. But the idea that people sit down together, whether it's to figure out how to lobby for the Second Amendment, or again, for a green space, or for ways to provide better movement in town for disabled veterans, those things bring people together. And they are often parts of national organizations, so they contribute to a nationwide conversation about issues that are important to people all over the country. Some of them have national meetings, some of them don't. But this idea that we have these political associations for Tocqueville was absolutely essential. Because what skills do you need to succeed in this world we live in? To be able to form coalitions and work out agreements with people with whom you disagree on other things. You know, sometimes people complain about the power of some of these associations. Doesn't matter which one. But what they all know is we don't talk about lots of issues, we talk about our issue. You want to ruin a political association? Get them to talk about abortion and having Puerto Rico as the 51st state and a lot of other things, and it all breaks down. You're there to talk about and do one thing, you agree, you're a gun lover, whatever it is. And so Tocqueville emphasizes the necessity of these, and he's impressed by how many there are. He says there are associations for everything. And they will draw up petitions, they will hire lobbyists. Right? Talk about what this needs to work. How about this? Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, and freedom to petition government. Those First Amendment freedoms are all exercised by these political associations. And this is so central to what Tocqueville wants to talk about. So, number one, local government. Number two, political associations. Now, number three, what he calls civil associations. We would probably say civic associations today. These are organizations that have no political agenda. That's the Kiwanis Club, and the Rotary, and the Rosary Society, and all these other kinds of organizations that develop. And like political associations, they're made up of very different people. And they also do a lot of things that government doesn't have to do because of them. And again, I'm going to use my own hometown as an example. We have a garden club. And the garden club decorates our village for every season. They plant the flowers in the spring. They put up the Christmas decorations on our fountain in the middle of the town. Doesn't cost the town a dime. And brings people together who, again, don't have other things in common. These are Republicans and Democrats. They want the fountain to be pretty for Christmas time. And they're willing to participate in that. We have a summer festival that celebrates our town. We don't have anything to celebrate, so we just celebrate the town. And it's the Rotary that does it all. Doesn't cost a cent. The Rotarians do it. They have the booze, they have the food at night, and all this sort of stuff to bring people together. And the town doesn't have to be involved at all. They simply have to give, a permit to put up signs and all that sort of stuff. So these societies do so many important things that otherwise government would probably have to do, and probably, let's be honest about this, badly. My guess is most governments aren't very good at putting on festivals. Or just, can you imagine New York City Council deciding Christmas decorations? And if you want to talk, well, I want to tell you about one example in my town. It's an organization called the Hearthside Cats. These are cat lovers. I mean, they love cats. They are male and female, old and young. One's a professor. Some don't have high school diplomas. One's the daughter of a Major League Baseball legend. They're all kinds of different people. They love cats. So what do? They put up signs all around town. They've got a rescue place for cats on somebody's farm outside of town. If you see a stray cat, you call us. We'll get the cat, we'll take it there, we'll clean it up, we'll get it neutered, and we'll make sure it gets adopted. They're fabulous. And how do they raise their money? Every year they have what they call the cat dinner. By the way, to them it's not a joke to say, well, how are you serving the cat? Don't do that one. Somebody tried that once. That was not good. And they raise money from the dinner, but they ask people who are not cat people, I being one, will you help out for the dinner? I always make the ice cream. I don't even like cats, but I make ice cream. And they, by the way, help things I'm in favor of. But it brings all sorts of people together, gives them a project, teaches them certain skills. You've got to have a treasurer. You've got to have officers. You've got to know when to go to the village board to get a permit, or whatever it is. And what Tocqueville says is this empowers people because somebody's going to say, the woman who's the treasurer of the cat organization is really good. Why didn't she run for school? Why didn't she run for county treasurer? Those are not full-time jobs. And so, in a sense, it's a breeding place for local officials. And that's good because, remember, you need local government to be effective. So all these things are interconnected. And so having these social organizations, many of whom do, again, great things. Again, one more illustration. The cat people do great things in Geneseo. Now, as you can imagine, we also have a dog problem. Let me tell you about our dogs. We don't have a dog fan club. So recently, the village spent $120,000 building a dog pound. 2 full-time employees, and I leave you with this question. If you were a stray animal in Geneseo, would you rather be a cat or a dog? And if you say dog, you're dumb as hell. Right? You want a cat lover taking care of you, right? And so this is the way our culture is enriched. People learn to work with different people. They do things that government sometimes can't do, shouldn't do, would do badly. And now, I think if Tocqueville, people always say to me, if Tocqueville would come back today, what would he be concerned about? Well, a lot of things. But it seems to me one thing would be that this civic society, whether it's civic associations, whether it's political associations, whether this an active and vibrant local citizenship with local government, all of those things I think have waned, partly just because of size. Right? Geneseo is still a town of 6,000, but just north of me is Rochester, and there are 750,000 people there. And so I think a good question is, how do, if we agree with Tocqueville that these things are important, that you've got to get citizens from the bottom up to mix together, to work together, to cooperate with people that they disagree with on many things or don't like the looks of, or, I wouldn't want my kid to marry you, but you love cats. I love cats. Let's work on cats. How do we recapture it? I think probably all of us would agree that a lot of that's vanished. How do we recapture that? Can we do it electronically? I went to look for some things on the web, and I found some very interesting things. There's a chat room for people who have skull tattoos. First of all, of course, they'll never meet. Secondly, you only see the body parts that have the tattoos, which, by the way, is an incredible array. I have a cousin who's into this, that's why I know this. But the point is, can something like that, or not something quite that strange, can these kinds of online chat rooms and things, can this replace what Tocqueville saw as so fundamental to our participation? I don't know about all of you, but it still always shocks me when you look at the number of people who voted in an election. Not even a presidential election, but in our school board, we'll get 15% turnout. Because people think, including people who would not be candidates, they think that it doesn't matter who's on the school board. Because those decisions are made by bureaucrats and legislators in Albany. My state senator lives 60 miles away from me, let alone my congressmen and senators. So how do we sort of rebuild some of that civic structure? It worries me. And let me just, we'll break for lunch in a minute, but let me just talk about one other angle of this. I was at a conference on democracy in Prague, at a conference started by Václav Havel, the first president of Czechoslovakia post-Soviet. I'm sure you remember him. And somebody said, looking at the world of places we would hope would become democratic, he said, you can have a democratic constitution in 6 months. You can have a market economy in 6 years. But at the way we do things, it would take you 60 years to have civil society. And do we think democracies can work if there's no civil society? I mean, I gave a talk in Slovakia a few years ago to a group of late teenagers called New in the EU. As I was preparing this, I realized that their parents were born and raised under communism. And these were from Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary. And so, I did all the usual things about democracy, said, you want to vote and so on. I said, you want to be a good citizen? Help out coaching the local soccer team. Do those civil society things and get in the habit. Because most dictatorships, if there's anything they want not to have, it's civil society. I think Myanmar is showing that by the day. They don't want civil society because it is dangerous. I urge, whenever I speak to a Rotary Club, and I do a lot of that, I say, contact the Rotary Club in Juba, South Sudan. They're really struggling. Contact the Rotary Club in Bata in Equatorial Guinea, where I'm trying to get some money from them for a project I'm working on. They have very little support in their countries because they don't live in democratic countries. And they need help. They need support. They don't know how to be a Rotary Club the way you do. They aren't embedded in their communities over long stretches of time like you. So if you want to be a good citizen, urge the Rotary to help out. And again, I said to these kids, become a volunteer soccer coach. Find out if anybody's delivering food to shut-ins. Those are acts of citizenship, because citizenship is active. It's not just pulling a lever every 1, 2, 4, or 5 years. So to me, there's so, I mean, we're going to talk more Tocqueville later after lunch, but one of the things I think is so important is for him to say that it's the equality of conditions, so it tends us to withdraw into ourselves, but America has the genius of having active local governments, active civic associations, and active political associations. And that is at the heart of things. And again, to have those, you need those First Amendment rights: speech, assembly, press, and the right to petition government. And, you know, we talk so much about the First Amendment. Very often we talk about religion and other things. Those are important. Obviously, those are important. We're going to talk about religion later on, tomorrow. But it seems to me that we need to get back to those basics and say, not let's do what Tocqueville saw in 1831. That doesn't work unless you're in my town. Let's figure out what to do. In New York City, they tried, for example, trying to have local school boards within the city, not just one school board for the whole city. That's an experiment. I don't know how well it's working. I've heard some good things, some bad things. But how can we find ways, using our technology and using what we know about the value of this, to help recreate an active citizenry with some training in the skills that allow us to practice democracy effectively? So if somebody asked me, what would Tocqueville do today? I think one of the first things he would say is, you've got to reconstruct civil society. You've got to reconstruct those institutions that were the genius of America, that in many different ways, whether it's by the federal and state government taking more power away from smaller governments, whether it is everything now being on the internet, whether it is people just saying, you know, everything's so big I can't make a difference, we've got to find a way to reinvigorate civil society. And I think, I mean, we talk about, you know, the economy and all the other things in our society. I would argue, in the long run, this is about as important a thing as we have to do, to say, how can we try, following the ideas, not the details of Tocqueville, how can we recreate these intermediate institutions, local government, political associations, and civic associations? So I think that's a challenge, and we can talk about that at lunch. Okay. Just a little bit of a preview of coming attractions tomorrow. Among other topics, I'm going to talk about religion, which is a very important topic for Tocqueville. Some things that he says about education and the relationship between democracy and excellence, about which he has some problems, by the way. That is to say, if you put, you know, if you're doing this, in a sense, aren't you squeezing some things down as well as raising some things up? So those are important questions for tomorrow. Also going to talk about women tomorrow, because Tocqueville has a lot to say about the family and about women in society. And although he wouldn't have known this, obviously, a few years after he passed through Western New York, one of the places he went through was Seneca Falls, where the first Women's Rights Convention took place. So anyway, that's sort of a preview of coming attractions, and I will think about some other things that I think I didn't say enough about, and so tomorrow is going to be those things plus some perhaps things that will seem miscellaneous. But I think now we want to continue the discussion. So we've got the microphone, and I hope it's loud, because although I've got hearing aids, sometimes I have to struggle.
Okay, Bill, we've enjoyed your talk so far. I refer to your books that give you some proof that some of us have read something of that book that you suggested we read. And it was mentioned in there that, and I assume it was written in the 1830s.
That's right.
Thereabouts. And he was complaining that 50 years earlier, the quality of the leadership was much higher. I guess he was talking about the founding fathers.
That's right.
And I was going to fast forward to today and thinking a lot of it has to do with self-confidence of our leaders. For instance, as an example, let's say Biden, instead of going after 40-odd executive orders to try to reverse everything that Trump had done, let's say he had complimented Trump on the rapidity that they had brought forth the vaccines. And if he had said how wonderful it was, and the fact that he didn't have the business expertise to have mobilized the capital to have gotten that all done, and he thought that maybe in the future, because he'd been so good at that, he would call on Trump if we ever had some very big projects to take on, he would call on him maybe to organize them. But to have done that would have taken a lot of self-confidence, I think. And I think it would have brought the country together greatly if he'd had the self-confidence to do that. And it seems to me that that's one of the lacking factors that we see in our senior politicians, no self-confidence.
Let me make a couple comments. Tocqueville, I guess like everybody, really did admire the founding fathers. Again, he read the Federalist Papers. Obviously, he knew the Constitution, and he knew it as a lawyer. One of the things that we sometimes forget is the Constitution doesn't mention or necessarily expect political parties to develop. So political parties are just beginning to develop in the United States when Tocqueville comes, and he's not very happy about that. Remember, he's here during the first term of Andrew Jackson, and he also met with John Quincy Adams, who was defeated by Andrew Jackson in his bid for re-election in 1828. So he looks down on political parties. But he does start by saying, it's not intrinsically bad to have political parties. There are great parties and there are small parties. And by that he means great parties are about positions and ideas. Small parties are about winning elections. And he makes that distinction, and he looks around and says, again, this is Jacksonian, John Quincy Adams time. He looks around and says, in America, I only see small parties. So already he saw that the division up into political parties was having a negative effect on democracy because it was about winning rather than defending principles. And that was a concern to him. And I think we forget how, it wasn't necessarily going to be true that the United States was going to have two parties. And obviously when you are designing supermajorities in the Senate or other kinds of things, you are not anticipating in the Constitution that it's very unlikely there'll be 2/3 of one party and 1/3 of the other party. So Tocqueville's already concerned about the political factions. In fact, party isn't even the word used in the Federalist Papers. He talks about factions. But the Democrats are formed, the Whigs are forming. In fact, Jackson wins the 1832 election. Tocqueville left just before. And in 1836, you get Martin Van Buren. And so I think it's just important to say that parties are just in the process of forming, and although Tocqueville doesn't know how it's going to turn out into a permanent two-party system, as it's been really since the Civil War, but the parties he saw developing, he didn't like and didn't think they were right for democracy.
Any other questions? It's on.
Thank you. So I read de Tocqueville years ago in law school, parts of it, and then of course I read it, and as I mentioned before, it's really one of the best books ever written on America. I thought he was enormously prescient on the issue of race, and this was a chapter that I read carefully. And he basically said, well, we don't know really how the races are ever really going to come together until they kind of blend, if you remember John Lennon's, I guess, comment about into sort of a coffee-colored people. But he was indicating that the only way that we would have some kind of comity between the races as they developed, as we developed personal interrelationships. And so, and we seem to be, I don't think this is going to happen in our lifetimes, but I think that this is where it's going. And I just wondered if you would comment on that.
The longest chapter in Democracy in America is on the three races in the United States, meaning Native Americans, enslaved blacks, and whites. It's not the most widely read part. For one thing, it's very long. And some of the stuff is sort of dated by the fact he's writing in 1831. Let's start with this. He really, really loathed and abhorred slavery. And he could not, in his mind, reconcile slavery with the principles of American democracy. It just abhorred him. I mentioned to somebody at lunch, Tocqueville's buddy, who went with him, Gustave de Beaumont, wrote a novel when he got back to France. It was a novel called Marie. It's a story of a white woman in Maryland who was marrying into a prominent family, and it was discovered she was 1/8 black, and that changed everything because she was black in Maryland. And it's not a great novel, but it's really a very passionately written novel. They were both appalled by the issue of race. Now, therefore, Tocqueville cannot imagine that slavery won't end. He knows that's coming. But he starts out by saying this: Native Americans could blend with whites, but they don't want to. Blacks want to blend with whites, but can't. And there is this great problem of the three races of America. And one thing he's sure of is that when slavery ends, things are not going to be much better for blacks for a long, long time. He understands it's not just about emancipating the slaves. It is, this is not his word, integrating fully into American society. Let me tell you, in all this book, he tells almost no stories. He's not a storyteller. It's a quite abstract book. But he tells one story that I always remember. He talks about going along the Ohio River down toward where it flows into the Mississippi. And on one side is Kentucky, and on one side is Ohio. And he says, I look over in Ohio, and there are people working hard, and they're going to the store, and they're on the roads. And I look on the other side, the blacks are in the fields, and the whites are sitting on their porches and don't work. And so that's his first glimpse of slavery before he ever was in the South. And what he immediately realized is slavery is incredibly destructive of the enslavers, as well as the enslaved. So this was a place where Tocqueville was really quite critical. Now, when he first got to the United States, we need to remember that in Europe in the 18th and early 19th century, with Rousseau and others, there grew up this idea of the Native American as a noble savage. And for the first few weeks, even a couple months, that Tocqueville was in the United States, he didn't see a single Indian. And he got to Buffalo, and the Indians he saw were all drunk and lying in the streets. And he was shocked by that, because this idea of the noble savage, this is what's happened to them when whites have come in and made them the minority. So Tocqueville, I guess like a lot of us, kept scratching his head saying, gosh, there's this democracy, all men are created equal stuff, except they haven't expanded it to include non-white people. So Tocqueville says, basically, getting over slavery after emancipation is a very, very long process. You know, those people, whether black or white, who thought $40 in a mule was going to fix everything, although of course that never happened, or any other kind of quick changes, they were not going to happen. And Tocqueville is kind of depressed about all this, because he really does believe in so much of what America is, and he just doesn't quite process completely why it is there is this sort of blank spot in the American consciousness. And when they're talking all that good democratic stuff, it doesn't include certain people. Gender is another issue. We'll get to that tomorrow. But the chapter on the three races of America, although it's very long and usually not excerpted very much in edited editions, I would recommend taking the time to read the 40 or 50 pages that it is. It's very depressing. Not about what he just says at the time, but what he says about how long it's going to take to get over it once slavery is finished, and why that's going to be so hard, and why whites are going to not do very well with it. So it's again the longest single chapter in the book, although not very much talked about. So I recommend people read it.
I don't mean to demean the difficulty of dealing with white versus black and slavery, etc. However, I think myself we've got a more fundamental issue, and that is the one concerning truth versus falsehood. We've had a history, and I guess mankind has had nothing but historical claims, etc., which are eventually either proven or disproven. We've now, at least I'm focusing on what are claims that are not really given a chance to be proven because of the lack of institutional credibility. By and large, or many of the newspapers have disappeared. Others are, we lack the confidence that we once had. For example, the old gray lady. Most people, myself included, have nothing but contempt for what I see in that newspaper, and very few alternatives to the newspapers as to what is a true statement and what it is that we can rely on as being factual. History is constantly being rewritten. How do you think Tocqueville would have approached that? I don't know if he had to even deal with it at the time.
He does. Let me say one thing, and that is that obviously, since I'm a historian, this interests me. Tocqueville has a section of the book. I can, if you want, talk about it more tomorrow, where he talks about the writing of history. And one of the things he reminds us is history written in a democracy, about the democracy, isn't going to look like history written in other kinds of societies. That is to say that, you know, we sometimes tend to say, well, history just, remember the old Jack Webb line from Dragnet, just the facts, ma'am. And history isn't just the facts. Yeah, I mean, yes, sometimes there's dispute over what a fact is, but let's put that aside for a minute. The bottom line is, and this is sort of historians being critical, it's what you do, the patterns you find, the way you assemble the facts that matters. And Tocqueville says history written in an aristocratic society can be very different than history written in a democratic society. He doesn't have a great deal of faith in the intellectual institutions and structures in a democracy. He thinks that part of the process of making a democracy like this is crushing the very top. He looks around American colleges and universities and he basically says they're not very good. They're not the Sorbonne, and since he'd been to England, they're not Oxford and Cambridge. And so he feared that one of the byproducts, unless you're careful, of democracy is a sort of intellectual mediocrity. He also says that one of the dangers of the equality of conditions is if you and I are completely equal, my voice counts as much as yours, my fact's as good as your fact. He doesn't quite put it that way, but he understands it's going to be much harder to come to an agreed to truth because there's much, you don't say, well, gee, this person has a Harvard PhD, he must be right. That's not the American way. And there's always, and he says this, there's a strong element of anti-intellectualism in America. He doesn't talk much about education per se, but basically what he says is it's broad and shallow. Okay? By French standards, almost everybody can read and write, but they don't necessarily think very well. So Tocqueville has some skepticism what the relationship is between democracy and excellence, whether it's in the sciences or in the writing of history or anything else. And so it is true, I believe, that writing history, comes from a perspective. The best historian ever in the world, as far as I'm concerned, is the great Greek historian Thucydides, who wrote the Peloponnesian War. And I have a Cambodian student living in my house now, going to college, and he just started Thucydides. And we got talking a little bit about objectivity and so on and so forth. I said, get the book and read me the first 3 words. And the first 3 words are Thucydides the Athenian. And he's going to write about the war between Athens and Sparta. He's not a bystander without interest in this. His side lost. And he tells people right away who he is. And although I think most people praise him for his objectivity, rightly so, nevertheless, he's the first guy to tell you, because he is the first guy to tell you, that this is going to be different than if you'd read a history of the same war with the same set of facts written by a Spartan. And I think for me as a historian, a lot of people don't understand that history is not like chemistry in a lot of ways. And that painstaking research is important, but that's where the work of the historian starts, when you've accumulated things. And again, the question is which facts are relevant, which ones are not. And different people seeing the same fact will rightly see things. That's why we need to read not just a conservative or liberal history of the United States. We ought to be reading from different sides. It's not that we pick one. And Tocqueville is aware of that. And so I'm not sure how he would deal with the problem that we have today, where somebody says, it is true that wearing a mask will spread the virus. There are people who say that, including a cousin of mine, but we'll leave that aside for now. But how do we agree on, not just how do we agree on what truth is, how do we agree on what fact is? And the real issue, once you discover, yes, somebody was in this place and said this thing, or yes, this battle was won by side X and not side Y, presuming we can get beyond that, the question is which facts are relevant and important, and that means that 10 years from now, somebody's got to write that history again. And when I studied medieval history in graduate school, we never studied women. I mean, you get Eleanor of Aquitaine or whatever, St. Clair, but you didn't study women. You didn't study peasants. Hell, peasants didn't write anything. And we didn't study those people. And gradually over my career, we find that we can learn a lot, not just about women in medieval society, we can learn a lot about medieval society by learning about the women in medieval society. Some of them themselves writers. There's a wonderful woman writer of the 15th century named Christine de Pizan. Her works were not known when I was in graduate school. She's now sort of a standard person to provide primary material for the 14th and 15th century. Her writings are quite wonderful, and we get to see the world from a different perspective. But Tocqueville worries more about quality. He doesn't talk as much about bias, except for the fact, again, that if you believe in equality of conditions, then my opinion is as good as your opinion. And we might even agree to that, but we would probably also go with Daniel Patrick Moynihan and say, yeah, but you can't have your own facts. You can have your own opinion, but you can't have your own facts. Tocqueville doesn't deal with that a lot, but he understands that the very process of history is a different phenomenon that starts from different perspectives than if the same history were being written by a European like himself.